Hi, I'm Jeremiah Hulsebos-Spofford, an assistant professor in the Department of Fine Arts, and I'm excited to share with you a talk called Floating Museums, Dialogic Monuments, and Radical Museologies through the lens of Claire Bishop. And I'm a visual artist, and I co-direct and I co-founded an art collective called Floating Museum, based in Chicago. And 5 years ago, when we were forming this art collective, I was reading this text, which became a really pivotal text by Claire Bishop called Radical Museology. And the collective is made up of Fahim Majid, Avery R. Young, and Andrew Shackman. And we were thinking about, as artists, how we could approach and really challenge and think about museology and museum practice through the lens of, being visual artists. And I was reading this book by Claire Bishop, and this text really became pivotal, and particularly this paragraph jumped out at me. She writes, "For Benjamin, the collector is a scavenger or bricoleur, quoting out of context in order to break the spell of calcified traditions, mobilizing the past by bringing it blazing into the present, and keeping history mobile in order to allow its objects to be historical agents again." You could replace collector here with curator, or as a visual artist, I was thinking you could replace it with artist. And the task of the Contemporary Museum opens up to a dynamic rereading of history that pulls into the foreground that which has been sidelined, repressed, and discarded in the eyes of dominant classes. Culture, therefore, becomes a primary means for visualizing alternatives rather than thinking of the museum collection as a storehouse of treasures. It can be reimagined as an archive of the common. And this is one of Floating Museum's first projects that we did in Southeast Chicago. And it was a pop-up pavilion where we partnered with the Southeast Historical Society, who has a really fantastic archive of labor history, steel mill history in Southeast Chicago. And Floating Museum was really interested in thinking about the notion of these collection items that were sort of in the basement of a field house, and how we could walk them right out the door and do pop-up program with live tours with the Southeast Historical Society members. And we essentially threw a big party. And this was our first move sort of into public space, thinking about, again, some of Claire Bishop's ideas around how museum practice could not necessarily be sort of this treasure trove and consolidating privilege, but rather be a common space out in public space. And that led us to really start thinking about how we could engage, again, thinking still about museum collections, but how we could integrate performance and events into our work. And this is a piece called Monument Reassembly. And it happened in 2018, and we worked with the Chicago History Museum in their collection, and particularly looking at this Peter Bullock photo in their collection from 1968. And on the 50th anniversary of this photo being taken, which was taken in downtown Chicago during the Democratic National Convention protests, I think it's a gorgeous photo, and sort of the people become the monument in a certain sense. And we were thinking again, just about monuments. Monuments obviously tend to be these symbols, sort of historical monuments, these hard bronze symbols of power structures, right? And generally, the people who had the wealth and power to tell their own stories. We were really thinking about reframing and how to reframe monument and collection into a public action. And if you go to the MCA Chicago right now, the piece was reframed for a group show called The Long Dream that is open until May 2nd. So I hope you can check that out. And moving sort of, continuing thinking about this idea around dialogue and the real wonderful potential of visual art and art practice, cultural practice, to be a platform, sort of a meaning-making platform for ideas we've been thinking a lot about how often in individual studio practices, artists' individual studio practices, generally it's sort of a solo mode of production. I'm really interested in the notion of collaboration and building together. I'm originally from Vermont, rural Vermont, and there's a thing called barn raising, and you sort of build structures together. And we sort of pose the question, could we build monuments together that might be not those bronze, hard, sort of systems of power sorts of monuments, but rather monuments built on collaboration. And this is a piece called Founders that was a collaboration with the artist Chris Papin and the artist Monica Rickert-Bolter. And it has to do with the founding story of Chicago. Jean-Baptiste du Sable was a Haitian fur trader, and he married Kitty Hawa, a Potawatomi woman, and married into the Potawatomi tribe. And with this piece, we were thinking again, you know, back to that notion of like that bronze horse rider. What would be a different sort of monument? We decided to make it inflatable. So obviously inflatables sometimes are bounce houses, right? That sort of material. But what it did for us was we were able to make it mobile. And it moved throughout the city in a program next to the Green Line train, which is just a fantastic way to get through and around Chicago. It's a raised train that's almost like a viewing machine. And we were hoping that these historical figures would sort of look the riders in the eye and sort of make a monument that, as opposed to a power structure, was actually about a love story. And that love story then went on to found, you know, the city of Chicago. And often it's an undertold story. And one of the goals, again, was thinking about, also with this piece, collections. And we worked with the Field Museum in Chicago, the Du Sable Museum in Chicago, and their collections, which are represented also in this sculpture. And also, I just wanted to give a shout out because this sculpture was also partially supported by a presidential arts grant. And I'm going to just close thinking back to Claire Bishop and thinking a little bit about, you know, contemporary museums. And with floating museums work, we're really working on this notion of making a new model for a public art practice museum and what that can look like, building bridges between lots of different institutions, community groups, and individual artists to collaborate to make new meaning. Thank you.